Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.
Welcome to episode 7 of the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Ray. Exciting show today. We go to China and we talk to Ulf Richter, Dr. Ulf Richter, I should say, from Tongji University. Had a great discussion about energy transition in China and what's going on there. Anytime there's big energy talk in the news, China is somehow related, and Dr. Richter was a spectacular guest to help us answer some of these questions that we may have here in the West and some of the misconceptions and kind of work through some of that with us. And so it was a great conversation. Before we get to the conversation, a couple things I wanted to remind you of. First, I will be in Northern California, the Sacramento area, the week of January the 16th. So if you're in Northern California, in the Sacramento area, shoot me an email, globalenergyleaders@gmail.com, or reach me at Twitter @RyanRaySenior. I'd love to grab a cup of coffee with you while I'm up there. Also, next week is our giveaway. You have to rate and review the show on iTunes. That's all you've got to do. Rate and review the show on iTunes. Last week we're in South Africa. This week China. Next week we're bringing on a professor to talk about global oil and gas. And so we've been going the global theme. We're going to give away a book for those who have rated and reviewed the show. So please take just a few seconds and do that for me. I would really, really appreciate it. And you could win a book. And the book it's one of the best books out there on the global oil and gas business. And so one final note before I tell you more about Dr. Richter. We hope you had a great Christmas and a spectacular New Year. And in 2016 has been a rough year for those of us in the oil and gas field. And so we hope that 2017 brings you more prosperity than 2016 did, and hopefully some more stability in the oil markets. Now, today's guest, he is literally a rock star in the energy business, and this is how big of a name this is. You may not have heard of him. If you haven't, go look him up. His full bio will be in the show notes, along with a link to his LinkedIn profile and the university where he works, just to kind of give you some perspective of who this guy is. A high-level government official in South Africa referred me to him several months ago, and me and Ulf have been talking back and forth. And so this guy really is connected in not only China but Africa. Today the focus was on China, but he is in the global energy business and really is one of the leading authorities on what's going on around the world. Just to give you a little bit about Dr. Richter, he's an associate professor of global business and strategy at Tongji University, which is based in Shanghai, China. He's received a doctorate in economic sciences, he's got an MBA, and he's a visiting scholar with the Social Innovation Center at INSEAD. He's the membership secretary at AIB Sub-Saharan Chapter and was previously a visiting fellow at Harvard University. Like I said, this guy is a rock star, and he really gave us some good information. Without further ado, here is my interview with Dr. Richter. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. How's it going over in China, which is 4 p.m. your time, 2 a.m. my time? Is kind of a weird time zone difference here, but how is it going in the afternoon where you're at?
Thank you very much, and it's my pleasure to be with you today. It's actually quite nice. We have a bit less pollution today. You may have heard there's quite a bit of problems in major cities. I'm based in Shanghai. I can see the sun is shining, and yes, it's a nice day.
Well, so the first question I really want to get into to kind of set the stage for what we're going to talk about today with China is someone from Germany. What drew them to China, and what brought you into the country?
So China today is, of course, not only a major producer, but also a major market. Many German firms have a major presence in the Chinese market, in particular Volkswagen, Daimler, Mercedes, and other firms. I've always been interested in, and also already when I was a student, I was encouraged to visit China. Today, China is the major market for many German firms, ahead of the United States. So, and Shanghai in particular is the major city where you can find German people. So we have a major presence here. The German Chamber of Commerce here in China, in Shanghai, is probably even more important than the American Chamber of Commerce. And so it's a very interesting place to be today. And also the Germans, let's put it this way, I had the German consul last year giving a speech in my lecture, and one thing that struck me that he said was that if you take the European-Chinese trade relationship, which is arguably the second most important after the European US-American trade relationship, according to his numbers or to his knowledge, 60% of this relationship is actually based on trade between Germany and China alone. So it's a very important relationship. And in general, we believe it to be growing very well consistently in the near future, because the German products, the German economy is quite complementary to the Chinese one. On top of this, Germany has a very good reputation inside of China. There was a country ranking last year in China, and Germany came out number one ahead of any other country.
Let's delve into that just a little bit more. Kind of explain for the audience what is the dynamics inside of China as far as the energy companies. Are they state-owned? Are they privately owned? Is there kind of a mix? And how does that work compared to in the U.S. where it's privately owned companies that run the energy sector?
If we look at the energy sector, most companies continue to be state-owned, but it's an interesting dynamic that is going on in the recent past. Many companies were, historically speaking, they were almost state bureaucracies, provincial or state level, provincial level, or city level. And but more recently, in China, there has been a trend for privatization. But it's not a privatization as we know it in the West. A city may sell its company, its electricity company, power company. It is more a partial privatization or liberalization of the market, and that includes the power sector, includes the energy sector, where the government here in China and on different levels is, let's say, experimenting with private economy. So many companies today, they may, and as is pretty much true for across the economy, they are partially state-owned and they're partially privately run. They very often still have a lot of bureaucratic structures from their historical state bureaucracy, but they've become very aggressive in their internationalization, in their also acquisition overseas, and in their venturing out, as we call it here. And so it's a transition period, and we do not know, and I don't think the Chinese themselves know how much they will transition in the end. But the argument is that China continues to be a emerging market that is changing very fast, where you find many sectors are experimenting with different forms of governance, of ownership structures, and of ways how to control and regulate businesses or industries. And the energy sector is one of the primary sectors where you can find that.
I was talking to someone from South Africa the other day, and one of the things they mentioned was that in South Africa they have privately owned energy companies, and then the government obviously is in charge of the environmental agency. And so as China goes through this energy transition, how are they balancing when the state owns the power company and the state owns the environmental company? How are those conflicts being resolved?
That's a very good question. So some friends of mine, they actually own an environmental company. They offer, so traditionally they would run a water treatment plant, and now they're expanding into other areas of treatment. And what's interesting about this company or this sector is it's not the energy sector per se, but what I found very interesting is that they obviously can only get contracts by having extremely good relationships with the local government. At the same time, the local government does want to give contracts to private companies in order to encourage, or they do believe in many cases they may be better run and may also be able to use better technologies. And on the other side, you do continue to see that, of course, the big players, they have much more resources. They have easier access to financing, both from government but also private banks or semi-private banks. So they're in a very interesting competition now, and I think the government itself is kind of observing how the private sector competes with the government sector. Now, what one can see, and which is a big discussion in China, is that, and you may have heard that there's a big fight against corruption at the moment, and the typical argument is that in government-owned, state-run companies, they often they find more cases for corruption, often also because the incentive structures are different, because it's very hard to pay high salaries and to motivate people in these companies. So they have all kinds of motivations to find other ways to make money. While in private companies, they are more Western style. Well, they have structures more like us, as we know it in the US or in Europe, where they can also motivate people through models that allow them not to enter into these kind of logics. On top of that, one thing that one needs to know in order to understand China is that almost every institution, and particular state-run institution, that includes companies, universities, etc., they have parallel structures. So they have structures based on the party system. So they have a party secretary that will control that the decision-making process is aligned with the political objectives of the country or the region, the city, etc. And that's most of the time not necessarily a problem, but it does create sometimes some side effects, because you obviously have to make these people happy, and that can mean different things in different situations. Yes.
One of the things we're seeing globally over the past few years is the dynamics in energy have shifted drastically. With the oil glut we're currently looking at, you see that OPEC has kind of gotten itself into a little bit of a quandary, and I think there's a lot of predictions out there that are pretty accurate that we're seeing probably the early stages of the demise of OPEC. The U.S. has struggled to kind of rebound from this oil glut. How is that affecting China with all these transitions that are going and the low crude oil prices?
Yeah, that's a very good question. First of all, one comment on the general situation here. China has been liberalizing the energy market to a certain extent. So a lot of companies have received licenses to, for instance, import crude oil, to import gas, which previously was basically controlled by 3 to 4 major, very large and well-known companies, including Sinopec, CNPC, CNOOC, Sinochem. So China is experimenting also in the energy sector with liberalization. And now, coming to your question, why is this important? Because one argument is that when looking at the oversupply, one of the reasons why we're not at $30 a barrel, but at around 50 at the moment, is because China has been buying huge amounts of crude oil, in particular, in order to build up its strategic reserves from originally 30 days. And there was a decision made, I think, in 2008 or so. We'll have to look that up. But the point is, they've been building large reservoirs and have been now, they're coming close to 90 days, which was the target, so to be equal to the United States. And previously, basically they've been buying all the oversupply across the globe. On the other hand, the state-owned companies, China itself does produce quite a bit of oil. They've been making huge losses because their calculations themselves have been based on a high oil price, much higher. So CNOOC, for instance, did post a loss of $7.5 billion, which is pretty massive, in its last corporate report. So it's different processes that are happening here in China at the same time. On top of that, the government is emphasizing its and also encouraging industry to invest into renewable energy. And China is already the largest producer of hydro energy. And also is massively investing into wind power and solar power, and it's now the biggest producer of solar panels. And also in terms of installed capacity, it overpassed Germany last year. So there's different. The general trend is, of course, China is continuous building its cities and its economy. They have to shift from oil. They have to shift from coal, which was a strategic choice back in the days in order to have cheap energy to develop China. And now the big question is, how can they transition into a lower carbon economy while at the same time guarantee energy security, which was basically the reason why they chose coal as the major source of energy to industrialize China.
Before we get back to Dr. Richter, let's hear from our sponsor.
For over 20 years, R Squared Global has served the energy and infrastructure industries. With offices in Texas, Alabama, and Louisiana, R Squared Global offers engineering, survey, right-of-way, and GIS solutions. For more information, please visit www.gor2.com.
And you mentioned the transition there. One of the things you see globally going on are these initiatives from government agencies to get their rural areas powered. And so you talked about renewables, and so you see the microgrids coming on and renewables taking hold in some of these rural areas where it's not really economical to build out a normal infrastructure system out there. How is China handling that problem with some of its rural development areas and getting energy to those far out areas outside of the metropolitan cities?
Yeah, so arguably, China today is the most experienced builder of power plants. They've been building power plants all across the country, many of them, of course, coal-based. They've also been installing a lot of solar capacity as well as wind. I think Xinjiang province now is the leading province in terms of installed wind power capacity in China. Interestingly, some of the problems that now arise are very similar to the ones that we have observed in Germany, that the energy production in Germany when it comes to wind power is in the north, but the major industry is often in the center and in the south of the country. So one of the major problems that China is also dealing with is not necessarily energy production, but energy conservation. Moreover, so same could be said about hydropower. China has a lot of rivers and does produce a lot of hydropower, but the cities, of course, most of the population, 50% of the population is in the coastal cities. So there has to, and a lot more can be done in terms of energy conservation. So that's a big topic in China. Now, for the rural areas, most of them have been emphasizing conventional energy in the past, but now the government is also thinking and experimenting with schemes, similar as in California, in Germany, and the UK, with different. And you see, Germany, China is also rather a regional. Has a lot of different regional economies, and different regions may try out different schemes in order to see what might be best. So while this is happening, of course, one thing that can be said, that in many parts of China, you still see a very underdeveloped region or area, given that the way how China has been developed was first some of the major cities had been built, like Shanghai and Beijing. Later, some of the second-tier cities. Now we're going to the third and fourth-tier cities. So it's very, very clear state policy driven, and less decentralized in its approach as it has been, for instance, in Germany.
You mentioned earlier that the pollution looked like it was kind of light today, kind of jokingly. And I remember when the Olympics were in China a few years ago, there was talk of all the smog and the pollution. And we have that here in the States, and you have it in any big urbanized area. What is the state of the energy sector, and how are they battling this, at least perception in the West, that they're not really aggressive on environmental issues?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's a very crucial question. China signed together with the US the Paris Accords, the Paris Agreement last year, in order to develop measures to aggressively tackle the problem of climate change and how to decarbonize the economy. China is actually being quite vocal and quite active about it, but it's always it's kind of a trade-off here. How much development do you want? How much technology upgrade can you afford? How much can you move away from cheap coal towards more expensive sources of energy? And at the same time, the demand of the more and more getting richer population here in China for a clean environment is getting, the population is getting more vocal, and in particular in social media, this has become a really, really important topic. So for the Chinese government, this is a very, very complex problem to attack. And the big discussion is, so one aspect, what many people argue, but which would also require huge changes and investments, is the move from cheap coal to gas. Now, gas would need a very different LNG and all kinds of other types of, let's say, installations, or the whole industry has to be changed. So that's one of the big discussions. The other discussion is, you may know that China now has very emphasizes a lot electrical vehicles, smart cities, and so on. So there's a lot of policy making around this, and subsidies, incentives for investment into that. On the same side, there's of course vested interests of the existing industries, and China is looking very actively at Europe, for instance, at the CO2 trading schemes and how that has been implemented and the learnings from it. Not everything worked out. So I would argue the pressure is there, but given the size of the population and the numerous cities, the challenges are also quite much bigger than anything we know in the West. Now, on the other hand, it's quite clear living here that the Chinese have to become much smarter than we have been in the past in our economies. And they have to do the energy transition much faster than we've done so. Now, given that I'm German, in Germany, we basically made a point that energy transition to a very large extent is a political compromise between the different stakeholders in a country, and it has to be agreed upon by many different parties, and then the necessary investments have to be made. I do think that China is coming very close to that point because, of course, the decision makers in particular, they can see very clearly, and this is a very recent phenomena, that if you grow too fast, the effects might be very detrimental in the long term. And you can already see now that cancer rates go up, and that diseases in general, so the population is really affected by the deteriorating quality of the air here in China. And of course, this is not just a Chinese problem, because given the size of the population, the size of the economy, this is going to be a global problem if it cannot be tackled anytime soon. Yes.
Well, I've only got two more questions for you, and I'll let you get out of here. One you've kind of already alluded to, but I wanted to ask it just a little bit more precisely. You mentioned earlier that China has been stockpiling oil. Have they been stockpiling natural gas as well?
No, they have not stockpiling it, but they've been drilling and discovering. There's a lot of shale gas also in China, and also some of the major drilling companies have become very, very successful in finding it. But just knowing that it's there doesn't mean you can actually get it into the economy and replace coal. You do have to build power plants that are based on gas and pipelines, etc. So there's a lot of investments that have to come after that. So that's, I think, the major problem. But most of the energy experts are quite clear that this is probably, in the short term, the best way to get away from or to decarbonize the economy. Yes.
Okay, so one final question for you. If we were to talk 5 years, 10 years down the road, what is the energy industry in China going to look like?
So there's a lot of investments into continues to be into renewables. There's a lot of investments also into what I believe is very important, into electrical vehicles, into mobility solutions that get away from the traditional gasoline-based vehicles. And on the other side, China has already been shutting down many of the heavy industries like coal plants and steel plants that have, not coal plants, steel plants, but and coal power plants that that have been the most polluting ones. There is also a requirement now that foreign companies, so pretty much everyone from Toyota to GM to Volkswagen and so on, that they have to very soon be 100% based on electrical vehicles. Now, that isn't yet the solution, because if the electrical power comes from coal, that really doesn't decarbonize that much, but the push into that direction is very clear. So I do very strongly believe that the Chinese government is pushing very hard towards that direction. However, there might be still a lot of vested interest of car companies that may not be able to invest into new technologies that may halt that kind of process. But I would argue, yeah, it's coming. It's coming very strongly. Yes.
Thank you so much for coming on today. You're so well known in the industry, and it's an honor to talk to you. You're always you're always doing presentations and going to conferences, and obviously you have your teaching job. Is there anything that you want to plug or promote so that the audience can be aware of what you have going on or where to connect with you at?
Yes, thank you for this opportunity. I do. First of all, I invite everyone to Shanghai. If you ever come to Shanghai, please come visit me here at Tongji University. I'm very happy to host you. Second, I do give speeches around the world. If they ever have an opportunity and meet me, please come up to me and let me know. And feel free to contact me. I'm very interested in innovative solutions from around the world that can be applied here and elsewhere. So feel free to contact me anytime. And thank you very much for this opportunity.
Well, it was good speaking to you, and we hope to have you on again in the future to talk more about what's going on in China. So thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Awesome stuff there from Dr. Richter. Thanks again for coming on. We really appreciate it. We will link to his full bio and his LinkedIn profile along with Tongji University in the show notes. Again, I want to pump our drawing that's coming up next week. Rate and review in iTunes. That's all you got to do. I will be in Northern California in January. Please shoot me an email if you'd like to meet up and you're in the Sacramento area. globalenergyleaders@gmail.com. And one more time, no matter how good or bad 2016 was for you, we hope that 2017 is a more prosperous year and the energy market treats you well. Until next time, keep climbing.
Thanks for listening to the Global Energy Leaders podcast, powered by R Squared Global.